Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with two Bible scholars to respond to a video made by Cosmic Skeptic, Alex O'Connor, and a person named Magnify on YouTube. They made a video talking about, I guess, poor translations and bias and different stuff like that in the Bible, specifically Genesis 1:1 of how to translate that, like, one of the most famous verses in the Bible, as well as other things about like women and whether they're looked down upon in Bible translations. So we're going to talk about that today. And Dr. Joel Koretko and Logan Williams. It's really awkward. Yeah, Logan Williams.
Dr. Logan Williams.
I'm
Yes,
also a doctor.
Also doctor.
Awkward. Yes, Dr. Logan Williams. Are both. We're gonna have a lot of interesting things, helpful words to say here that will help us have a better understanding of these topics. How you guys doing today?
Great.
Yeah. Well, it's very early.
Yes,
For
very
me, at
early.
least.
Not for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so if you're watching this, you shouldn't be because you should be in church, unless if you're all the way across the country. But otherwise, yeah, let's talk about why we're doing this, why we're making this response.
Sure.
Joel,
Yeah, Logan,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, I'm
Yeah.
give it to you.
Okay. Yeah. So I think, in general, I think scholars have a responsibility to respond to public misinformation. I think I wouldn't really want to call this misinformation because I think the many wrong things that are said in this video are mostly harmless. But in particular, I agreed to do this because I really like Alex's channel. I think it's really excellent. And I've been a kind of on and off viewer of it for a few years. And when you get in front of potentially upwards of 1 million people, because I think he has about 1 million subscribers, or maybe a bit less. I don't know. Then you subject yourself to the criticism of experts, in my opinion. So this video is just ripe with a lot of problems, and so Joel and I thought it would be worth responding to. I don't usually do these things, but because I'm a viewer of that channel, and I think I maybe have something relevant to say, I'm here today.
Very nice.
Yeah, I could echo those sentiments. I've also been a viewer of Alex's channel for a while. When I was at Oxford, Alex was also at Oxford, and we were both part of a debate group there. And so we had some friendly chats and stuff like that. And we have a mutual friend. So I like Alex's channel. We've chatted before, and I've always been interested in some of the dialogues he has. But this one in particular, within like a few minutes, it was quite evident that there were some really, really big issues with what was going on. And like Logan said, if there's potentially 1 million people, I think the video is 150,000 views or something like that now. If that many people are viewing this, there's a lot of things that they can take in as they're watching, and come out with some potentially misinformed views, along with some okay things as well. But like the amount of problems that there were really doesn't kind of even out with the good. I think in this particular case.
It's not the worst thing if people are wrong on the internet about Hebrew, which is probably more often than not. But at least the scale of this, at least I think, merits a kind response.
Yeah. All right. And what about tips? Any tips you guys want to add? Want to mention before we begin?
Joel?
You go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. This is just a general tip for everyone who is learning any ancient language, but especially Greek and Hebrew. Everyone who teaches Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic knows that after your first year or two, you don't really know enough to say anything. You know enough to be dangerous, and to know enough to know how to misuse the language in a way that sounds authoritative. And what I said before the stream, and maybe this is a bit too, gatekeepy of me, but like if you're someone who is not growing up with Hebrew, not in a Orthodox Jewish community, for example, and you just kind of like are picking up Hebrew on the side, I know that Magnify said, I think he said he lived in an Orthodox community for a few years. I think I saw him say that on a video. But generally, if you haven't like seriously, carefully studied Hebrew in some kind of academic or academic adjacent context, you probably shouldn't be getting in front of, or if you haven't done that for maybe like 4-5 years, you probably shouldn't be getting in front of 1 million people and saying things about Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
That's my pro tip for anyone learning Hebrew.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Okay. And so what that some people are gonna be like, oh, that's really dismissive, right? So like, what is your background in Hebrew, Joel?
Yeah, okay, we can start with me. Yeah, so my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation was on translation studies between Hebrew and Greek, so the Septuagint. At Oxford, I worked on the Book of Exodus, the Greek translation of Exodus. So I do a lot of work in Hebrew that way. I would by no means call myself like a Hebrew specialist. I'm not. I'm a Septuagintalist, but that doesn't mean that I can't work in these languages with proficiency, and am aware of a lot of the scholarship, and I think I can at least not be dangerous.
Yeah. I started learning Hebrew in my undergrad in I think I took my first semester fall 2013, and have been immersed in learning Hebrew ever since. I did a degree in biblical languages at the University of St. Andrews. I did my PhD at Durham, which wasn't on anything related to Hebrew, but was on New Testament texts. But at Durham, I taught Hebrew, and I've taught Hebrew in other contexts, and done a little bit at my current post at Aberdeen when I've filled in for lecturers who would have been teaching Hebrew but weren't available and things. So I'm also not a Hebrew specialist. There are like, people like Jeffrey Kahn students at Cambridge, for example, who like specialize in Hebrew grammar and, lexicography and linguistics and all that kind of stuff. Neither Joel nor I do this, but we are competent enough in Hebrew to teach it seriously at an academic level. Just the point about like that sounding dismissive. I'm not saying that, no one can have interesting things or insights to say about Hebrew. It's more like I don't want people to make a fool of themselves in a large public stage.
Right.
That's the context of my pro tip.
Right.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. And I won't even be doing much talking today, but I should say that so I've done 2 classes, or I guess Hebrew 1 to 4 with Kairos Classroom, and I've interviewed a bunch of biblical scholars on this topic. So this should be a fun topic today. Let's just get into it here. And let's see here. All right, awesome. This is of course going to talk about Genesis 1:1, but also some other things. So make sure you stay here for the whole video if you want to get the full understanding of the video here.
In terms of the language and history of the Bible. We were just speaking a moment ago, and you told me that we could potentially do an entire episode just talking about the linguistic quirks of the very first phrase of the Bible. You open the Old Testament, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what I always read. What can you tell me about it?
Well, there's a little bit more to the English version of Genesis 1:1, because as you said, it's in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then there's a period. There's a big fat punctuation mark, which is really quite interesting because as like an ancient language, ancient Hebrew doesn't have punctuation. So there's a big question about what is the significance of introducing a punctuation mark into a text in which one wasn't there. I think in ancient Hebrew, there is like little markings on a scroll to let you know when you've reached the end of a line. But that's not the same thing as a period. And a period definitely has a meaning of like this idea stops here and doesn't continue on to the next one. So there's a big question about whether or not there should be a period at the end of Genesis 1:1.
What difference would that make? Because what comes...
So what's your thoughts on it so far? Anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I can chat a little bit about this.
Go ahead.
And he's going to get into some more here, so I'll just kind of preface it as well, preface the whole thing in the discussion he's going to bring after this. So, like, the question of punctuation in Genesis 1:1 is a real question in biblical scholarship. Like, that's accurate. The problem in translation, though, is whether it has to do. It's not whether it has to do whether or not we can figure out where a period can go. The question relates to Hebrew syntax. That is the way in which Hebrew puts sentences together. So I think Magnify kind of starts getting at this. Oh, we've got Logan hi for me. Look at that.
Oh, hi, Nick. Yeah.
So in Genesis 1:1, part of the debate is whether the word to create is one of two forms, which I think Magnify is going to kind of touch on in a bit. And that does change the way that the sentence is phrased. So ancient Hebrew did not have vowels included for its words, and so readers would need to insert the vowels. So in Genesis 1:1, you can assume the vowels that would make a finite verb, created, that is, in the beginning God created, or you can assume the vowels make what is called an infinitive construct. This is another way of taking this, similar to the English infinitive, like he went to eat, or I love to swim, like infinitive, to. Without getting into the details, and by the way, Logan's about to he'll go into some other ways of reading this as well. But without getting into the details, in Hebrew, an infinitive can also function kind of like an ing verb in English, like while eating or while swimming. So if you take create in Genesis 1:1 as an infinitive construct, you get in the beginning to create. And that's not actually a translation.
In the beginning of God's creating.
Of God's creating.
Right?
So I gave it there as like a real translation, but just to show that there's like the infinitive there. So an actual translation being more like when God began to create the heavens and the earth, or in the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth. So the first sentence becomes what we call then a dependent clause. Oh, and what does that mean? Because again, not everybody in the audience is going to know this. It means it's an incomplete sentence. When I went to the store, when the clocks turned back. Like, these sentences can't stand on their own. You've got to complete them. When I went to the store, I ate cheese. When the clocks turned back, I was super tired. Like, the sentence needs completion. So too, for Genesis 1:1, if we read it as a dependent clause. So if it's when God began creating the heavens and the earth, or in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth, then obviously you can't put a period there, right? It's when God began creating the heavens and the earth, what? The sentence needs completion.
Something else.
Yeah, but it's not about whether we can figure out where to put a period here. That's actually not what's in question, right? It's rather, what does the syntax of the Hebrew say, which will affect how the sentence is broken up. Ancient Hebrew readers did divide their sentences up. They did so intuitively based on normal patterns of language. And I think Alex and Magnify nod to this in the video as well. You don't have to have a period to know when a sentence ends in Hebrew, though. That's just a modern English convention. It can be just as apparent when a sentence is broken up based on the governing norms of a given language. Typically in Hebrew, the sentence is going to end when there's a full clause, subject, predicate. This is what you expect in English too. We use periods as a convention.
Yeah, and he's hinting at the fact, and I think rightly identifying that the insertion of a full stop at the end of in the translation itself is doing a lot of work. Right, it's interpreting the syntax of Genesis 1:1 as a complete independent clause. An interesting question here. The clause does end in the Masoretic in Leningrad Codex, so it ends with a sof pasuk, which he's referring to there when he says in some Hebrew manuscripts there are markings or whatever. I think he's specifically talking about, as in the Masoretic text that we have, there is a sof pasuk at the end of 1:1, which divides up the verses. I'm not sure though if you would have to take the sof pasuk as the completion of a clause. I mean, that's a question mark. I did not look at all the sofe pasuk in the Masoretic text in preparation for this. So I'm not entirely sure if the presence of that punctuation mark or cancellation mark in the Masoretic text is completely as misleading as he suggests. But yeah, I think I agree with Joel that the main issue is, how do we construe the syntax of this clause? Do we construe it as an independent clause, as a dependent clause, as something else? How are we interpreting the verb? All those things go into whether in English we put a full stop at the end of that sentence, or even that we treat it as a sentence, right? But the issue here, as Joel identifies, is primarily one of syntax in the Hebrew, and not as much about punctuation. Although I agree that the punctuation mark in English is doing a lot of work at the end of Genesis 1:1.
Yeah, that makes sense. And
And the
you wanna
construal of
tou-
it as an independent clause, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything did you want to touch on, like the other options for
Well,
syntax on
I
that?
think the rest of the clip
Okay.
will, yeah, we'll get it after he says some more things. I will explain the kind of the syntactical options here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Just real quick, I wanted to mention. So I've interviewed a number of scholars on this topic. There's a playlist in the description. There's multiple videos. If you want to like really, for people that are not familiar with this topic, you can watch those videos, and they go in really good detail. They describe it really simply with stuff on the screen and all that. But just real quick, I wanted to mention what he means by soft pasuk is this little 2 dots at the end here, which was not in the original text, but it was added later. But there's a good question of like, oh, is that the end of the sentence or whatever's going on there? But otherwise, let's see here. Let's go back to where we were. All right. Nope, that's not. Okay. There you go.
Was next, and the earth was without
Shapeless and void, and the
Form
Spirit
void.
of God moved over the spirit of the waters.
Yeah.
Another period there. And God says, let there be light. And there was light. So in the English version, by the time you get to let there be light, there may be 3 or 4 periods or 3 or 4 stops. Are you familiar with the Bible translator, Robert Alter?
No.
He's like probably the most highly regarded working translator. And he spent, very unusual for a Bible translator, that he spent about 20 years translating classical literature and then got sucked into this project of translating the Old Testament with all of that literary sensitivity to style and format that maybe someone who went to seminary isn't sensitive to. So when he talks about Genesis 1:1 and the punctuation, the literary effects of punctuation in Genesis 1:1, he talks about that it really slows down the pace, and that for an original reader, there's a sense in Genesis 1 that the universe is happening extremely fast, like an explosion almost, which is really interesting. And so when he translates it, he says the original reader would feel that this is all happening very quickly. Like in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was shapeless and void, and God said, let there be light, and there was light.
Right.
And Hebrew is also a much more like economical language, quicker language. So the first verse, I think, in Hebrew, Genesis 1:1, is 7 words in Hebrew, and it takes English 12 words to accomplish the same thing. So it's nearly double the speed, takes double the length of time to say it, and it's got these plotting period marks that remove that information that this is an event that's happening rapidly. And you could say that is meaningless information, that it doesn't change anything about it. But to me, that seems like a interesting way to communicate something about the creation of the universe, that it happened fast rather than in this calculated, slow way, more of like an explosion.
Yeah, well, the image that I have in my head of Genesis is the sort of old man in the sky sort of doing this and doing.
Yeah.
What do you think, guys?
So we can come back to the explosion thing in a moment. I just want to circle back to the syntax of 1:1. I thought there was more there, but I was clearly wrong. So there are 3 ways broadly that you could construe the syntax of 1:1, and I'm not saying these are all ones that are equally viable, but there are majorly 3 ways you could do it. So the first is to simply, the first way is to construe it as most of our English translations do. Not, I think, not the JPS, but like the NRSV, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? And what that does is that it takes Bereshit, the first 1 or 2 words, depending on how you construe it, in beginning, as an independent prepositional phrase, right? In the beginning, and then you get the rest of the sentence, God created the heavens and the earth, full stop. Although that's the translation that most people, I think, would be familiar with, I think in my general assessment of Hebrew scholars that I know, I think I'd say most people don't think that's a legit translation of the Hebrew. Joel, am I on track with that?
Yeah, I think most people I talk to and most that I read, usually they take it as the dependent clause. And like a minute ago, I gave a particular reading of the dependent clause, and I think you're gonna give a couple other options.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna expand on that, right? So we could take it as an independent clause. That's the first thing we can do, but most people don't think it is that for a number of reasons. But let's talk about the other options.
Dependent clauses.
Yeah, so dependent clauses as in some form of when God created or something like that, which means that there shouldn't be a full stop at the end of 1:1. So there's three ways of doing it. One is to simply say that bara, the word that's usually translated as create, but actually bara Elohim es hashemayim ve'et, is identical syntactically in its function with the infinitive bro. Now, Joel, you mentioned this, bro, meaning to create. If we repointed the vowels, right, if we inserted new vowels into the consonantal text as it is, we would get Bereshit bro Elohim et hashemayim ve'et haaretz, which would mean at the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, etc., etc. So the way that Rashi resolves it, and a number of other scholars, is just to say that, well, the verb is actually bara. We shouldn't repoint it to baro, but it's syntactically identical to the infinitive baro, as in that's how it should be read. I don't find this convincing because you can't just say that a finite verb is now an infinitive. So I think the instinct is right, but I don't think that's correct. The other way is to simply repoint it and to say, no, actually, the Masoretes who give us the vowels below bara, as in two comatim, were wrong, and it should be pointed as baro. So, and we do this a lot, right? And even the Masoretes themselves do this, right? Where they have, they say, oh, or, and a bunch of, as well in the rabbinic tradition, they'll say, oh, you might read this, but actually you should read this. So often we find examples of people disagreeing, with the standard reading of what's in their manuscripts. And scholars have to do this all the time. We always have to posit that maybe actually the vocalization would have been different here than what's written in our manuscript, and that makes more sense. I can't think of examples off the top of my head, but they are numerable. Yeah. So that's one way in the beginning of God's creating Bereshit bro as opposed to Bereshit bara. The other way, which was proposed by Robert Holmstead, I think in 2008, in the article Vitas Testamentum, Robert Holmstead is himself like a linguist and works on Hebrew, did his PhD on relative clauses in Hebrew. And he argued that in Genesis 1:1 is an unmarked restrictive relative clause. Okay, let's back up and talk about what we might mean by that. So let's say that there are two Logans playing volleyball. And if I'm trying to refer to one or the other, and I'm facing the court, I might say, the Logan who is on the left. Now, what's that doing? The relative clause, who is on the left, is disambiguating between two live options. So that's what's called a restrictive relative clause. It's a relative clause that's disambiguating or specifying the referent in an otherwise ambiguous referent. So if you said the day on which the day on which the clocks went back, because we're on that example, that would also be a restrictive relative clause. The day on which, not just any day. If I say on the day, what day am I talking about? The day on which the clocks went back, something, something, something. So note that that phrase, the day on which the clocks went back, is not a complete sentence, right? It's a relative clause that's restrictive and has a preposition built into it. The day on which the clocks went back, I was really tired, or something like that. I think actually when they went forward, I would be tired. Other way around. Sorry, I'm just pulling from your example, Joel.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So right. So now an unrestricted relative clause, in English, you have to have a comma before it. So if I said, Joel, who is with me right now on the call, used the example of daylight savings earlier. that who doesn't disambiguate. If I say Joel in this context, you know what Joel I'm talking about. The who clause or the relative clause is providing more information that's relevant, but it's not determining the referent. If that makes sense. I hope that makes sense to everyone. So that's what's called a non-defining relative is what they would. So we have restrictive or defining relative and non-defining or non-restrictive relatives. So what Robert Holmsted argues in light of his very erudite research on relative clauses in Hebrew is that Genesis 1:1 is a restrictive relative clause that's unmarked. Now we also have this in English. If I say, the day the clocks went back, I felt really rested. Note that I don't have to say the day on which or the day that. I just say the day the clocks went back. In English, that would be an unmarked restrictive relative clause. Now, it turns out that the same kind of phenomenon happens a lot in Hebrew. And if you ever tried to read the Psalms or poetic texts, this is freaking everywhere. And I remember in my first few years of learning Hebrew, they would drive me insane because in Hebrew, you do have a relative clause marker, namely asher, which means who, that, which, or what, or something like that. But often these unmarked relative clauses just show up in poetic texts, and they're not the most intuitive. When you're learning Hebrew, they're not the most intuitive things to recognize. So anyways, if we take, as Robert Holmsted argues, Genesis 1:1 as a restricted, unmarked relative clause, we get this. In the beginning in which God created the heavens and the earth, etc., etc. Personally, I think this is the most convincing take. One, because it doesn't require repointing. Two, because it doesn't require just positing that bara functions as an infinitive when it isn't an infinitive. But that would entail, to agree with Magnify, that would entail that we take Genesis 1 as a dependent clause. Now, whether it goes through Genesis 1:2 is a difficult thing to decide. I generally take the entire phrase to be that restrictive relative clause. So, in the beginning in which God created the heaven, or the beginning of, the beginning in which, it's hard to render in English straightforwardly, but the beginning in which God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, darkness on the face of the deep, a divine wind was rushing over hovering over the face of the waters. God said, let there be light. So I take Genesis 1:3 as the matrix clause, basically, as the main verb of the independent clause. But point being is that there's a lot more complicated issues surrounding the syntactical construal of this phrase, and more than just vocalization issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was very long-winded. I'm sorry, but it's hard to explain.
Did you want to add something, Joel?
Well, that was actually a really good explanation of restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses. So I think you did a great job there. But no, just to point out that obviously this is actually quite complex in many ways, and there's a few different options, live options for how you get a dependent clause here, and we're trying to give you kind of all those, which I think you gave a really helpful analysis there of that one. Do we want to move to his comments from the clip we just did about the Hebrew moving really fast? So this is in line. This is all explosion. Yeah. This is all still in line with the same comments on syntax and all that. So he just to remind everybody that Magnify says that the Hebrew is moving, quote unquote, extremely fast. He says Hebrew is a quicker language. The first verse is in Hebrew is 7 words, and it takes 12 words to accomplish this. In English, it takes twice as long to say. The creation happened fast by virtue of the syntax, like a explosion, like you said, Logan.
I think he says that.
Sorry, no, I meant like you had just said like an explosion.
Sorry,
not that you said that. No. Yeah. So I'm a little bit confused by this claim that the text is moving extremely fast. He's saying Alter says that. I would have to go back to whatever he's referencing for Alter. Maybe it's just his normal translation, like the annotated translation. But from what I can tell, and I read it like you, Logan, as a dependent clause, it seems to me that this isn't extremely fast Hebrew. This is just normal Hebrew syntax. As you said, you can see this in the Psalms if we do the unmarked relative clause. And I think a case can be made that text is actually not really that fast. It seems possible that all of verse 2 is either a continuation of the dependent clause, could even be taken kind of parenthetically with the fronted noun that happens there. That's a regular way to signal background information in Hebrew. But if it continues the dependent clause like that, that's fine too. In any case, the completion of the dependent clause, like you said, Logan, wouldn't be until verse 3. So when God began to create the heavens and the earth, blah, 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 God said, let there be light. So that's a nice, long dependent clause. I don't see this syntax as particularly jumpy. It's not terse or rapid in succession. There's no explosion is what I'm trying to say. In certain contexts, you could use different sentence structures to cause like a rushed effect, maybe like if we want to go with like quick effect of syntax, quick effect of the sentence moving, like a synditon, like omitting conjunctions, like and. You could. Sorry, you gonna say something, Logan?
No. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I thought you were coming. Yeah, like elision. Omitting certain parts of the sentence, certain ways of doing parataxis, like putting clauses together without subordinating or using specifying glue, like so to speak, like among other things. But we don't see signs of that here. I don't think that there's really a rushed thing going on. We could even talk more about this comment that there are 7 words in Hebrew and 12 in English, as though this was a part of a significant difference in the translation into English, and part of this so-called like rushed effect in the original. I think here we're probably dealing with a bit of a misunderstanding of how translation works. Well, like and I think most people could intuit this. When you go from one language to another, there are sometimes things that just don't come along, and there are sometimes things that do come along. You're going to add something sometimes because the translation language doesn't do the same things as the source language in just one word. That doesn't make things clunky or fast or slow. That's just part of the process of going from one language to another. Some languages will use one word, where another language it'll take 2. If I say Textgeschichte, that's one German word, but in English it would be text history, 2 words. In some languages like Hebrew, a preposition gets attached to various words rather than being its own separate word. And then when we bring this into English, we separate prepositions for our prepositional phrases. So the amount of words that it takes to get from one to the other in these cases is just irrelevant. But especially so in this context where Magnify is claiming a significance between 5 words. The real question when it comes to whether the translation is accurate or not is whether or not the same information is being conveyed. And in the case of Genesis 1:1, there is nothing about having 12 words in English that loses the information. Having 12 words has nothing to do with it being a mistranslation, which is the premise of the video, right? And there's not really anything in style or rhetoric that's lost. At least I don't think so. But even talking about this, I'm kind of conceding that his claim that the Hebrew is moving fast. I don't think this is the case. Maybe you can make a claim that the discourse is moving fast, and this could be what Alter is claiming, but that's not the same thing as saying the syntax is moving fast or quickly. But if we said that the discourse is moving fast, that has nothing to do, again, with it being translated incorrectly, and there's nothing in the syntax that supports that, which is the claim that Magnify is making. He's claiming the grammar and syntax move fast. He actually says we ought to read the first 3 verses in one breath, which I don't think is the case. You can go, I went to the store, or when I went to the store, I ate cheese. Like there's no reason to make that kind of claim here. What do you think, Logan? Does that make sense?
Yeah, your explanation makes sense.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, also before I actually give my response, I was just thinking while you were talking. I'd say I think I would agree by and large that with the statement, maybe that Hebrew is a more I think he said economical. I'm not sure exactly how he phrased it. Language. But then I was thinking of like a bunch of examples where like actually you could translate a number of Hebrew phrases that would end up with fewer words in English. For example, if I said the ground on which I'm sitting, in Hebrew, I'd say ha'adama asher ani yoshev aleha, which would require more words because I have to repeat the reference of the relative.
Yeah.
That's literally the ground which I sitting on it. Well, I guess because we say I am, it actually ends up with the same amount of words. So maybe I take it back. But there are things in Hebrew that like redundant, sometimes we call redundant relative clauses, but they're not. They're redundant to English speakers, but not to Hebrew speakers. But that requires, that relative clause would require more, or if I said, there are a number of other examples like this where actually Hebrew is more wordy than English. And a good example is, as we'll get on to, the use of the direct object marker, which you don't need in English, but you do need in Hebrew. You don't need, but appears in Hebrew in a number of instances. Okay, so on to the explosion thing. So I just think there's generally like a confusion here between the putative. Again, I wouldn't grant this like you, Joel, but let's grant it for the moment. The putative or ostensible fast presentation of events in Genesis 1:1, and then the rate of the events referred to, right? So just because you present something syntactically in a terse or quick way doesn't mean that therefore you're saying that those events happened quickly. So the move from the speed of the language to the explosion, to the event being portrayed as an explosion, just doesn't really make sense. So for example, if like you're in a film and then there's like a montage, right? And all of a sudden it says like 3 years passed or something, and then like there's a lot of fast forwardy things and like sunsets and sunrises or something happen. That's not telling you that therefore the sun has sped up, right? It's just the presentation of the events is quicker, but it doesn't mean that you therefore interpret the events as necessarily happening in a shorter amount of time. So I'm not really sure that you can get from quick syntax to it's therefore portrayed like an explosion. That's just a confusion between syntax and the style of prose and the information communicated. But also, like Joel, I don't even think it's the case that the presentation of the material is quick. If anything, it takes potentially 2 entire verses of consecutive dependent verbal clauses, consecutive verbs in a dependent relative clause to even establish the background information that it takes to then introduce or to get to then the first independent finite verb. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and a divine wind was rushing over the faces of the water, God said. If anything, that's actually very, very, very slow. To have a temporal, or in here, conceptually temporal, but a relative clause function that for that many words, and then to have just vaihi, vayomer yahi or, that's 3 words as the kind of main phrase, right? Vayomer Elohim, I think it is, right? Yahi or, and God said, "Let there be light." Vaihi or, and there was light. The main clause is very terse, and the dependent clause is very, 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 very long. So I don't think there's any sense that this syntax or the prose is happening quickly, let alone that it's communicating that the events themselves are happening at some kind of breakneck speed. If that makes sense. I also think, like, obviously this is supposed to be somehow suggestive that it somehow relates to the Big Bang, and that's why it's interesting. But it's just that's what it sounds like to me. That why Magnify finds it interesting is because it maybe you're saying that the Hebrew actually communicates that the universe began with an explosion. Isn't that interesting? Because modern scientific accounts would also say the same, and I'd just say like it just doesn't communicate that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I picked that up. Maybe he was getting at that. Maybe that was like a little like a kind of subtext for what.
Yeah, I feel like he's saying like an explosion. You know, like
oh, okay, yeah.
like
he does
that's
mention,
what it sounded like to me.
Yeah.
I'm like, why does it matter if it's like an explosion?
Oh, yeah, I didn't really pick up on that.
That's kind of the vibe I get. I mean, I don't know, Zach,
Okay.
if you got the same vibe, but
Yeah, I mean, this whole conversation was like, how does this have to do with the topic?
yeah, yes.
Like,
Yes.
I when I first watched it, I was like, is he even talking about the same thing? Like, this is just like a big side note. And then you guys mentioned it. I was like, wait, those were supposed to be connected? Like, yeah. So yeah.
Wow, we're like 40 minutes in, and we're only like 2 clicks in.
Well, this
Sorry,
is
maybe
a
we
long
gotta go
part.
quicker. Yeah.
Yeah, we
I
do
do
need
want to
to- yeah.
mention before we keep going is there are like some conservative scholars, John Walton, that take it as in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But yeah, as you were saying, yeah, most non-conservative scholars that I've noticed don't read it
That's
as
just
like
my
limited God.
anecdotal,
Yeah.
like from
Yeah.
people, from all the
That was
Hebrew Bible
anecdotal.
scholars I know. I don't really know many people that really think that it's an
Will,
independent clause.
Daniel McClellan would say it's the consensus that when God began to create is the translation. So that's fine. But
It'd be cool. Yeah, if he has the data on that, I'd love to see that. Like
Yeah.
if he's compiled something or something.
yeah. Anything else to add before we keep going?
Carry on. Someone's trying to get into my building, I think. Can I just, can you guys just carry on
Go
without
for
me
it.
for about 30
Yeah,
seconds?
yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Let's watch the next one. Yeah.
It's the second word of the Bible. So the first one I think everyone agrees on. It just means like at the start of something or in the beginning. It just takes one Hebrew word because again it's more economical. So everyone's agreed that about the first word, but then there's a lot of disagreement about what is actually beginning because the second word of the Bible is a verb, create, and since there's no tense in ancient Hebrew, there's a lot of the tense of a verb is like derived from context clues. So there's a lot of question over what is actually beginning at the beginning. And then there's a lot of question about whether created should be in the past tense, created, or an infinitive of to create and to create. So in the beginning of God's act of creating versus in the beginning God created. Does that make sense between those two?
It could read something like, in the beginning of God's creation,
Yes.
This happened.
Yeah.
Or it could be in the beginning, God made a creation, something of that
Yes.
sort.
And I think the difference there is almost like if you look at a comic book strip, in one version, the first cell of the comic strip is just like a blank square because it's the beginning and there's nothing there yet. And then God creates the heavens and the earth and it all appears in the second strip, the second cell of the comic strip. In the second version, if it's in the beginning of God's creating, then in that first cell of the comic strip, there might be some primordial materials that are already there. And then God starts to decide to make something out of it. So it's the beginning of his creating. It's not saying like in the beginning. It's just like, well, when God started to start making some stuff. And if you look at the actual like text, it seems to be more in support of that second option because the second verse talks about the earth being shapeless and void and the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. So if that verb is truly past tense and God created everything, how was there all this material before he created anything? So it doesn't seem like it's saying in the formal beginning of everything. It's just like,
Typically the
All right. What do you think, Logan?
Oh, you're
You're
muted.
muted.
This is where things get really, really rocky, I think. Where to begin? Okay. Let's start with there's no tense in ancient Hebrew. In principle, what he means by that is that the katal form, which bara is in, as in the stem is kal or the stem is kal, and it's in what we usually would refer to as the perfect form of the kal. It is the case, I would agree, that the Hebrew katal form does not encode time with respect to the time relationship between the time of the event and the time of utterance. So I agree with this in principle. But this has nothing to do with what he's talking about. Because what he is talking about is whether you should take the form as a finite verb or an infinitive verb, which Joel, you touched on and I touched on as well.
He created to create. Yeah, just so
Yeah,
everyone's aware.
yeah. So, so he said in the beginning, create, which would be more, if you'd render it as a gerund in English, something like in the beginning of God's creating, right? Which is if you took bara as an infinitive, either as functioning as an infinitive like Rashi does, or as baro, if you repoint it, that would be a legitimate translation. But that's a difference in mood, not a difference in tense. So, and the problem arises because we don't exactly know how these would have been vocalized. So bara and baro, the katal perfect finite form, and baro, the infinitive form, are two live options if we're dealing just with a consonantal text. But this has nothing to do with whether time is encoded in Hebrew verbs, or more specifically, whether the Hebrew katal form encodes a temporal relationship between the time of the event and the time of utterance.
Which in turn has nothing to do with the pre-existent, non-pre-existent, whether it was past tense, like that. That's what he's also getting at, right?
Yeah, So I think there's something about like if it's because of the past tense, how does this therefore relate to if time isn't encoded in verbs, then it leaves ambiguous whether there's what the relationship is between previous existing matter and God's act of creating. That's an interesting question. Just has nothing to do with the tense. Now, if you take Bereshit bara as referring to an absolute beginning, then sure, then that's that's like an interesting question. But then that has to do with, this and this is where I think the key point is that the question, the question more specifically concerns the relationship between Reshit and bara, or the consonantal form Beit Resh Aleph, right? And then within that, there are multiple, or as a part of that question, there are multiple sub-questions about the form Bereshit or Reshit. Is it definite or indefinite? And is it absolute or construct? So if the form is infinitive and it's baro, then Reshit is in construct with the form baro, and you would say in the beginning of God's creating. Reshit would therefore be definite, but definite only because it's in a construct chain with a definitive event. That doesn't mean you're referring to, therefore you're almost certainly not referring to an absolute beginning here. But the point is that I don't think he's understanding what actually goes into this question, which has to do with the noun reshit, its syntactical relationship to bara or baro, how we point those verbs, which has nothing to do with tense and has nothing to do with whether time is encoded in a katal form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just different questions.
Joel, did you have more?
No, maybe let's move on to the next one because we're running pretty long here. Yeah.
The image we have is God creates the heaven and the earth. So he sort of pops into existence this thing called the earth, and then there is this earth which is without form and void, or formless, or whatever word you like to use. I've never quite known exactly what that means for the earth to be without form and void.
That's kind of an encroachment of like Greek philosophy onto the text from what I've read, because the word that's actually used in the Hebrew is like a made-up word, like helter skelter. And then when I guess the Greek translators were trying to figure out how do we communicate this made-up word into our new culture, they kind of borrowed that classic Greek idea of form and formlessness. And so that's like more Greek encroachment of a more philosophical statement, where
that's fascinating.
Hebrew uses like a more playful word for just kind of like the earth was helter skelter, I guess, basically.
Yeah, but do we know what that word is trying to sort of get at?
It's just like a made up. It's like a made up word, like it's like a sing songy word.
Really? And we don't see that word used anywhere else?
I think it's used one other time in Bible, but as like an intentional reference to where it appears here.
Really? So I suppose we don't really know what it's supposed to be saying. So we've got like, in the beginning, God created, or potentially in the beginning of God's creation, the earth is something.
Yes.
And immediately the meaning of this text is falling apart to me, and makes me want to go and study Hebrew, to be honest, because I just can't get a grasp of what any of it means. It's really interesting what you say, by the way, about the Greek encroachment
Yeah.
on
So,
the text.
Joel, this is
Alex,
all you. I got nothing here.
well, Alex,
Yeah.
he goes on this like little talk about biases in translation or whatever, but they kind of end this conversation real quick here, so I'll go ahead and mention
Sure,
that
I can.
first.
And it's kind of scary, actually. So I mean, how do you think we should read this text? Carefully is probably the correct answer there, but how do you approach it?
The way that Robert Alter translates it, who I really admire, is he translates that phrase as the world was welter and waste. So it's like it's a little playful and a little bit more childlike, and it's like kind of sing-songy because you can't manufacture a new word in a language. But he says it's welter and waste, so it's like a little poetic kind of
Welter
rhymey,
and waste.
because formless and void sounds so like stately, and like the original is, I think, a little bit more playful and a more childlike. So to be true to that literary effect, but
Well, you've spoken a lot.
Yeah, I can make some comments about this.
Mm-hmm.
Is that all right? Yeah. So Magnify makes like the odd statement that tohu bohu is a quote unquote made up word and a quote sing-songy word. By this, I assume he means that it does not have meaning in the Hebrew language. An equivalent in English would be like saying any random combination of rhyming sounds. At least this is how he seems to be presenting it. So if I say like Zibi Zabi or Luka Luba or whatever, Alex, Alex goes on to say that, like, as you heard, we don't know what it means, and Magnify says, yes, we don't know what it means. He then he goes on to say that he likes Alter's translation, welter and waste, because it's a playful and sing-song, and it's playful and sing-songy, and you can't manufacture a new word in the language. That's what he says. So this is apparently just a meaningless term that's been translated in another meaningless way, apparently. There's two things Magnify is saying here. And just by the way, Alter's translation clearly has meaning, so I'm not quite sure how that's coming through. But there's like two things I think Magnify is saying. One is tohu vavohu might be playful in that there's a rhyme to the phrase, and two, that tohu vavohu doesn't have any inherent meaning in Hebrew. As the first claim, the playfulness, I actually don't really see a concern here. And I think you could make an argument for the playfulness of the rhyme if you wanted to. Whether or not the tone of all of Genesis 1 is playful, which he seems to be inferring, I don't think that's clear on the surface, but that's not the main problem with what he's saying. Maybe you can make a claim that Genesis 1 is like a peaceful text based on the lack of like theomachic kind of parallel things we see in like other ancient Near Eastern texts, like gods fighting each other, but that's not in Genesis 1. So it's playful and peaceful or something. Maybe that's what he's thinking. I don't know, but that's not really the problem here. The problem is that the second claim, that tohu vavohu doesn't have meaning, that's problematic. First off, I don't know if anyone noticed, but Magnify just assumes tohu vavohu is one word. He says a word, right? It's actually two words, tohu and then conjunction and vohu. So it's two words. And these two words do have meaning. In fact, Alter doesn't seem to be saying they don't have any meaning, because Alter translates with welter and waste, which those are meaningful English words. He does so to match the rhyme of tohu vavohu. I think that's why he's saying welter and waste. But Alter's translation is trying to get at the meaning of these terms. They're actual Hebrew words. Scholars have worked really hard at parsing out exactly what they might mean, which is actually contested. So I will say that it is contested what these terms mean, but no one is arguing that they have no meaning, that it's zibby zabby, right? Alter's translation, welter and waste, it's a meaningful statement. It's a way of talking about a desolate state. So rather than saying tohu vavohu doesn't have a meaning, what scholars, and I think Alter probably would claim, is that, or I don't want to speak for him, but many scholars say that these words form what we call a hendiades. This term refers to when two words are combined to create one idea. So in English, we might say, he risked life and limb. Life and limb are not meant to be taken separately, but convey one idea. He risked his personal safety, right? It's like the sum is more than just the parts. This type of expression is called a hendiades. It's literally one through the two, as in one meaning expressed through two words. So tohu vavohu is not a meaningless phrase, but rather it is two known Hebrew words, brought together to convey one idea, and hendites. This is what many scholars argue for this phrase, scholars like John Walton, for example, as Zach just mentioned. But a hendites does not mean that tohu bohu is meaningless. It's not like zibi zabi or whatever. It actually has semantic content. In fact, the same scholar, John Walton, he wrote a book on Genesis 1 as Ancient Cosmology, and he and others go into great detail to discuss the meaning of tohu bohu. And so he ends up coming out with a translation that he tries to get away from like material ontology, and he goes for functionless, or I think his translation of both together is non-existent. So the hendites means non-existent. Whereas other scholars like Tsumura go for unproductive and uninhabited. In any case, scholars do think this phrase has a meaning. It's not zibi-zabi, right? That's just not the case. It's Hebrew words with semantic content, probably a hendites, and then okay, well let's try and get like as close as we can to what that means. But it's something to do with desolate, unproductive, functionless. If you go Walton's way, like that, like there is meaning there. That's quite apparent. And the word, like we see tohu especially appear all over the place elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, and so there is meaning. So that's one thing. And to his second point, I think that's just it's a pretty big misunderstanding. He also claims that Greek philosophy is behind the translation of formless and void. It wasn't quite clear if he means that like the English translators are affected by Greek philosophy, or if it's Greek translators, because he does say like Greek translators at one point. And so is he saying that the Septuagint, like the Greek translations, affected the way we understand, or is he saying that English translators who have Greek philosophy in mind, or like actually it's not clear there? But in any case, the Hebrew translations that I just talked about, they are basing it off of the Hebrew meaning, not off of a Greek philosophical lens or something like that. Like the formless and void comes from Hebrew, not from Greek philosophy. And you can look at the Septuagint; it doesn't actually go the same way as formless and void. It's a little bit different. So
auratos,
yeah,
maybe
unseen, maybe.
Yeah,
there's actually a debate on this.
Yeah,
in the
what
literature.
auratos means. Yeah.
You can see Rob Hebert is actually a mentor of mine.
Yeah.
He was one of my main profs in my master's degree. He wrote an article in 2019 just talking about whether or not this relates to Greek philosophy and kind of arguing back and forth. But in any case, like when it's tohu bohu and formless and void, people are going for the Hebrew meaning there. It's not being rendered through a philosophical lens.
Yeah, and void is not akataskevatas.
Yeah.
Or not
Unprepared.
influenced by. That's the other side of the Greek translation. Yeah, I'd also add Jeremiah 4:23, Raiti et aretz v'hine tohu is the other instance, the only other instance where this phrase tohu appears. Just because it's a reference, and I probably think this is right, that it is a reference to Genesis 1:1, or sorry, Genesis 1:2. That doesn't mean it's meaningless, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like there's a kind of a weird, like, oh, is it used anywhere else? It says no one more time, but it's a reference to Genesis 1:1, but it, yeah, it has meaning. That's, I mean, it can be an illusion and also have meaning.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, bohu appears also in Isaiah 34:11. You said Jeremiah 4:23, and then tohu appears in a lot of other contexts as well.
Yeah, a bunch of other. Yeah. Just the phrase tohu bohu is only one more time. Yeah. I'm referring to aretz, right? So that's relevant. Yeah, we can carry on.
Yeah, okay, but I think someone in the comments said, okay, well, tohu isn't made up, but bohu is made up. It's a made-up word. But if it's used in Isaiah 34:11, that seems to go against that idea, does it not?
Yeah, I think he said. Is bohu used there?
Yeah, bohu. I'm just reading Walton like off the screen here. Isaiah 34:11 and Jeremiah 4:23. Yeah.
Actually, no. So it's not next to each other, but it's it says aleha kav tohu va'avne vohu.
Yeah.
So the similar, it's used in the same sentence.
Yeah.
Probably because it means something.
Yes, exactly.
Even if that meaning is obscure to us, that doesn't mean it didn't mean anything in Hebrew. The threshold for saying that would be very, very high. Yeah.
Yep.
Anyways.
All right.
All right. Okay. Oh, that's awkward.
As a past, future, or present version of any word at all.
You might say, like, in English, we would say, I walked to the store
Mhm.
to say I walked to the store yesterday, but like in an ancient language, you might say yesterday I walked to the store, and there's no the verb is the same verb as
Just
if you're
walk.
talking about the future, present, or past, and then what there's still I feel like a lot of languages that maybe Thai or something like that
Yeah.
that
Well, sometimes
work
when
similarly.
you often notice the quirks of different languages when you have a non-native speaker trying to speak English, right? Like you might hear somebody say something like, "Oh yes, yesterday I walked to the store,"
Hmm.
and you know what they mean, of course. And you're like, "Oh, that's not quite correct." And you think, well, maybe English isn't their first language, but that's probably a result of the fact that that's not a thing that they would do in their language. You know, if I'm trying to say something in a language I don't really know very well, I might try to sort of piece together English words, and it ends up coming sounding very strange. I walk into a shop and I'm like, "Excuse me, I look for toilet nearby, so I may relieve, thanks." You know, something like that, right? And it's like you get the message across, but something to do with the way that sentences are constructed. And I suppose a lot of that's probably going on in the Bible.
Yes.
Like, and we have to sort of adapt it to English.
And I think it's especially powerful in the first verse of the Bible when it actually has a narrative difference about whether God is creating the universe from nothing or whether, in line with a more ancient cosmology, that he's organizing the universe from pre-existing materials, which I think to a modern reader, we're like, how could anything exist before God created it? That's not logical. But an ancient reader might be like, oh yeah, there just always was stuff around.
Viewers of my
Okay.
Yeah,
so
I mean, so we've
we've
already
cut
kind of.
off. I was just gonna say. So he mentioned, yeah, Hebrew doesn't have tense, and he kind of went on to that. What were you gonna say?
Yeah, I was just gonna say we already kind of covered this, but again,
Yeah.
this is another example where he's like, because it doesn't have tense, this is why we have the problem of whether referring to an absolute beginning or not, and this just has nothing to do with the whether these verbs encode time.
This as part of a universe of things that you are pulling it out from. So then every time you mention an object, you're stopping to remember that chaotic entirety of all the
Wait,
materials.
I think we
in the universe
skipped.
and
I think we
You
skipped a
skip-
little
yeah,
bit.
you gotta back
Yeah.
up a little bit because the introduction to what he's saying there with et.
you're just pulling it out from a change. You call
Went
the
a
last letter.
minute too far.
red telephone box that's out on the street right over
Yes.
there.
No,
And
yeah,
so-
further back.
Further
There's
back
this
still.
word that
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
rather than just like
Like a concept or
yes.
abstract, like the difference between saying
a general thing, like a specific thing.
yeah,
Hey,
like think about the red telephone box.
You gotta
No,
still
no,
go
it's
further.
still,
You're
it's
still
still
further,
back.
Zach.
Yeah.
This is not my fault. It's the notes.
Sorry, that would have been my fault actually then for miss.
Where were we at then?
including out of the 7 words in Genesis 1:1 in Hebrew, 2 of them are not even translated into English.
Yeah, we're good here.
Really?
We're good. Thank you.
My next question is going to be, which ones?
What are they?
and what should they mean?
And that's because there's a special kind of word in ancient Hebrew that you use anytime you want to specify a specific object in the world. You preface it with a word that signals that you're about to conjure up a specific object rather than just like
Like a concept or
yes.
abstract, like the difference between saying
a general thing, like a specific thing.
Yeah, like think about the red telephone box
Yes.
versus I'm going to talk about the red telephone box that's out on the street right over
Yes.
there.
And so there's this word that's 2 letters, et, which is made up of aleph, which is the first letter in Hebrew, and a tav, which is the last letter. So it's a little bit like saying A to Z or A to Z every time that you call out a specific object. And you could say that that's just like a grammatical article for clarity, but a lot of like the mystics or the rabbinical scholars would say that more than just like a procedural word, it's actually like an important ceremonial word, and that every time you're stopping to reference a specific object, you take a moment to remember the A to Z's, the A to Z, the universe of things from which you are calling out that object, to know, like you were saying, that an object doesn't exist in isolation. An object exists as part of a universe of things that you are pulling it out from. So then every time you mention an object, you're stopping to remember that chaotic entirety of all the materials in the universe, and that you're just calling out a little bit of it. And you're stopping to do that every time you use a direct object. And that's definitely been lost to time. Like modern Hebrew speakers use the word et probably with as much thought as we just use articles like a, and, in the. But a lot of the mystical thinkers from going back 1,000 years would say, no, this is an important ceremonial word to take a moment to communicate what it is you're doing when you are referencing an object.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And so is this like every time you say something like there's a chair over there, or go and pick up a banana or something, like anytime you say like a singular object noun, you would say this word et?
I picked up et banana.
Right.
In English, we would say, I picked up banana.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay, so where is that used in Genesis 1:1?
So it would be in the beginning, God created et the heavens, and then et again the earth. So both of those are objects, heaven and earth. And before those are referenced, there's that little interesting word there. And then I suppose the English translators just decided, oh, English doesn't have this function, so we can just omit those two words because they're not necessary. Everybody knows when you're referencing a direct object in English, it's clear from the syntax. But that's a really interesting thing to do if you're claiming to be translating the inspired word of God. It's really fascinating to already in the first verse decide that there's information that's irrelevant.
Why is there information that's irrelevant?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, this is a doozy. This is going to take a minute or two. This was quite the claim, and quite the little dialogue. So we'll back up and we'll just kind of walk through it. All right. I don't think we actually got to the point where we talked about the script. Did we?
No, we didn't.
No. It'll
come up later.
Okay, so we'll do that one. We'll do that one after. So yeah, well, let's start. So Magnify said that anytime, so his word was anytime you want to specify a specific object in the world. That's what he said, anytime. You use et in Hebrew. So just as a basic claim, that's not true. The direct object marker et is not required to mark a direct object. So it's not anytime.
Or subjects.
Yeah.
Yeah, or right. Anything that's not the object of a verb, you would never use it. So it's not anytime. It's only right. Only in specific syntactical constructions and in syntactical locations. Or
yes,
when the noun is functioning as in a certain syntactical way. Anyways, sorry.
Yeah, by direct objects, just so audience is aware, I just mean the thing that gets affected by the verb. So in the sentence, the cat killed the dog. The dog is the direct object. In English, we know what the direct object in a sentence is because of word order, which they said. If I switched the cat and the dog around, the direct object would change. The dog killed the cat. So in Hebrew, they sometimes mark the direct object with the term, but it's not required. In fact, one of the most respected Hebrew dictionaries, Halot, it says its presence or absence does not affect the meaning. So that's just basic, well-known fact. So to say that the word is always there is incorrect, and to say that it is meaningful is incorrect. But maybe he just misspoke with the anytime. So we could actually give him that. It's easy to do when speaking on the spot. But Alex, and maybe you want to speak about this, Logan, Alex gives the examples. There is a chair over there, and I picked up a banana as cases where et would be used.
I love this moment because it's I love and don't like this moment. But those are two examples where you would not use you cannot use the form et, right? So if you say there is a banana, if I'm speaking modern Hebrew, let's just say that I don't know what the word for banana would be in ancient Hebrew. I'm not sure we have an example of it. Joy, you can correct me. But I can't say yesh et banana. I would just say yesh banana sham. There is a banana there. Now, modern Hebrew speakers do use the phrase yesh et, although I think Académie Lashon Ivrit, the institution that's meant to decide what's proper and improper Hebrew, would say that's not correct. And it is more of a recent development to say yesh et something, yesh being the form for there is. But if you said go and pick up a banana, you can't use et because the object is indefinite. There's a bit of a moment where I think Magnify realizes this. He says in English we would say go pick up banana, but we wouldn't say that. We would say go pick up a banana. But yeah, you can't use et in those instances. So I think there's a big kind of red flag here for in this moment. I wonder if I had anything else briefly on that.
I can go on. I think maybe we can move to when Magnify says, I guess the English translators thought we can just omit those two et. What is which is really interesting, which is a really interesting thing to do when translating the word of God, to decide that there is information that is irrelevant. If you are claiming your worldview is from the Bible, wouldn't you talk about the Bible? Wouldn't you talk about biblical worldview? Who decided that was irrelevant? Okay, I'm just going to talk about this quick, and then after that, we'll move to the next clip. Zach, I have a pretty hard time with this, partly because of the tone, because it came across like you're avoiding the Bible, you're avoiding what's truly there, kind of thing. So that was what I got, the feeling of the tone, but mostly because of just the inaccuracy. And so I'll say plainly, there is nothing special about et, and no modern English translators are losing a single moment of sleep by not translating it. No one is deciding it is irrelevant. There are no diabolical translators, Christian, Jewish, or otherwise, scheming to omit stuff in the modern Bible translations, which is kind of the inference he's making. Like, why are you removing that from the translation? It's important. Well, no, that's not true. I'll say it as clearly as I can again, so the audience gets it. Et literally just marks the direct object. What did he eat? He ate the chicken. Et tells you what was affected by the verb. The chicken was the thing eaten. It was affected by the verb. That's it. Et can be omitted or used, and often it's not going to matter. If it does matter, it is often because et helps to clarify the relationship between words in a sentence in Hebrew, where the word order doesn't function the same as English. Like in Hebrew, the direct object might not be clear, so add et, and it'll be clear. There's nothing more to this. There's no secret meaning. In English, we don't have a direct object marker, and so there's no need to translate it. But like the exact same information is provided in your English translation, like exact same information, 100%. So
Yeah,
to give it an go ahead.
I was just say that the information point is important because English does communicate information with word order.
Mm-hmm.
So, or for most of the time, the object comes after the verb. So by not using et, even though we're not translating it with a word, it doesn't mean we lose information because the information is still communicated with the word order in English. So even though the word is not carried over, the information is there, and the information is, what is the direct object? And every English speaker is not up in arms saying, I don't have enough information to figure out what the direct object is of this sentence. Now, whether it should be a full sentence is a different question, right? But yeah, so there's the difference between what words come over and what information is communicated are not the same thing. Do you want to talk about the whole like mystical et thing, or?
Yeah, I'll briefly just touch on that. Then we'll keep going. We're actually going to keep going on this point because he's going to get into script and stuff too.
Yeah.
So he's saying that there's this mystical aleph tav, this like beginning to end to like put into this word that was an old way back meaning. Like we're going to talk more about that, but like this is equivalent. Like to give an analogy is if I said,
yeah. I wonder if there are many schools of thought which believe.
Zach, what you doing, man?
I didn't mean to. Sorry.
That's all right. So, okay, an analogy just so that the audience can kind of pick up on this. If I said, the letter A, it's the first letter of the alphabet. It's like the beginning. It's the alpha. And when I say, what's a cat? A cat? Well, a cat. I must mean that objects like cats, they have a beginning. They're metaphysically dependent on a first cause. They are a cat, a cat. I use the word right? Like you see how that makes no sense, right? Like that's like I'm just trying to give an analogy here, like where you're just taking one little thing in the language and imputing and importing all this kind of mystic information into it, when in normal plain speech that would never fly. No one would ever perceive that. And so we're actually going to see even more. So we're going to keep going on this for a little bit more to show.
Yeah, and it might what he says about medieval mystic Jews might totally be true. That's not my specialism, so I'm not going to speak on that. But we're talking about how to translate an ancient text that's way older than medieval Kabbalah. So I don't see the relevance. It's an interesting point if that's how medieval mystic Jews thought about this, but it doesn't impinge upon how we're translating the direct object marker in a text that's much more ancient.
So I think the next clip goes into even the ancient idea here, so we could go to that.
Not a good word.
Especially if you're talking about, this isn't just a written language, this like proto-Semitic script. This is like some of the first time that language is ever being written down at all. So it's like there may have been some of these customs that were very meaningful to people using written language for the first time that have slowly lost relevance or like slowly stopped being important after thousands of years of writing so many text after text.
That's what happens with language when you pick a word which is supposed to have a lot of significance and
That was a fun one. What do you think?
Go ahead, Joel.
Oh no, it's I think it's you.
Oh, sure.
You
Yeah,
go
just
for it.
briefly.
Yeah.
So magnify makes reference to a Proto-Semitic script. There's ignorance of a basic issue here, though maybe he misspoke, though I think he says it again. Or he says Proto-Hebrew, I think. So Proto-Semitic is by definition a reconstructed language for which we have no written evidence. So when you say Proto-Indo-European, Proto-Semitic, like these are reconstructions of it's one step removed from anything we have evidence for. So by definition, Proto is a hypothetical reconstructed language. It's not written. I think he's talking about the script. The script is not Proto-Hebrew. It's called Paleo Hebrew. The script that we see in modern Hebrew is actually a form of Aramaic script, or a development of an Aramaic script. The earliest writing is from Sumeria, I think late 4th millennia BCE. We are like way far removed from the composition of the Hebrew Bible, let alone the existence of Hebrew. Like we have thousands of years in between the first writing and the penning of Genesis 1:1. So there's just some ignorance of some basic issues here.
Yeah, I mean, we could be extremely charitable and ask, does he mean Proto-Semitic script as in like early Canaanite Phoenician script that has like an alphabetic script? So if he's meaning that alphabetized script, that's not based on syllabic or logographic cuneiform or something like that. If he means that first kind of writing that resembles the kind of writing we have today in many parts of our world, at least, alphabetic language, even if he was saying that, it's still off by like almost a millennium, right? From last I checked, we have early alphabetic Canaanite-like language demonstrated, like, I don't know, around 1700 BC or something. Like, it's been a few years since I checked in on this, but we have various artifacts. I know there's a comb, like there it is, the Lachish comb, where it says something about I don't even have it offhand, but it's like getting out the lice of your beard in order that you might get the lice out of your beard. And it's from an alphabetic, like early Proto-Canaanite kind of alphabetized script. So we have that, but that's still well removed from the Hebrew Bible. We're talking like early beginning of the second millennium BCE. And I mean, even while we're talking about ancient language, even to claim that the direct object marker might have some ancient special meaning, what we could note is that if we go to respected grammar in ancient Hebrew, Joan and Moroka, they speculate about the origins of this word. So we have scholars who have looked into the origins of et. And this word probably doesn't even come from just the bare combination of aleph and tav, which is the whole premise of his argument, right? Aleph, tav, beginning, end, first letter, last letter of the alphabet. It might originate from a verb like ava. I've seen that. That's actually in a few places that I looked. We see in cognate languages that the direct object marker has an intermediary vowel in between, represented by a consonant as well. In other words, there's another letter between aleph and tav. So it's not just aleph and tav, even in cognate languages.
Yeah. Well, that comes back up in the forms of the direct object marker with pronominal suffixes.
Exactly.
So we have otcha, right, or oto or ota, and not et.
I was about to say that actually. Yeah. So
sorry. I'm sorry. I thought you were moving on. I was like, oh wait. That's actually in Hebrew
no.
Yeah.
No. So that we actually have that. So he's saying et, aleph tav, this whole thing, this whole mystic thing. But that was the wrong statement. In many cases, it's ot. So there's actually an extra letter in there. So it doesn't even look like aleph tav. It looks like something completely different. And so is the mystic meaning still there? Is that like, but now you've added an extra letter in, so it's not even apparent. So it almost just that kind of just makes the whole argument fall apart, because in a huge host of cases, it's not aleph tav, this direct object marker, aleph vav tav. So again, I don't think he's taken the time here to think this through. So he would need to substantiate this. He'd need to show an ancient text that says aleph tav means something about like conceptualizing nouns, and so give me something from an ancient text that talks about it like this. But otherwise, there's no reason to state this, except for maybe some mystic rabbinic sources in the medieval times. Yeah,
and that is due to the fact that Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, is a gendered language, so that every single noun that is used has a gender that's either male or masculine or feminine, and there's no possibility for a neutral gender, much like French or Spanish or something like that. So in that first verse, you would say, in the beginning, God, which would be a masculine noun, created the heavens, another masculine noun, and the earth, which is a feminine noun.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a question about how much original readers are like paying attention to that, the meaning of a gender of a word that's used, because like French speakers, I don't know, aren't stopping to think about, oh, I use the word for bridge, and that must be, what is the French word for bridge?
What's the French word for bridge?
Un pont. It's
pont.
masculine.
It's masculine.
Masculine. But do you think of a bridge as masculine? Like, does that affect the way you see the object?
No, no.
Because I didn't think so, right? But I didn't know.
Precisely.
I assumed not. So no.
Yeah.
There is one study that I think I wish I knew who the researcher was, but they did see if there was any bias of whether like French speakers perceive bridges to have more masculine qualities inherently,
Right.
like that they might be more sturdy.
Strong and yeah.
And I believe they did find like some detectable difference for some words.
Did you hear? I don't know how much of this is true. It might just be like a Twitter thing, but people said that when they've named hurricanes after men rather than women, because you get like Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, but when they name them after men, people take more precautions because they take them more seriously because they perceive them as more like violent and destructive. It's
after coming out of Helene,
Mm.
that is definitely very interesting to me right now. That people would be like, oh, we don't need to do as much for this
but
one.
it's surely it wouldn't be something that they would even consciously do, right? It's not like if you asked people, you know, are you gonna? Well, they're calling it Helene, so do you think we should really? Do you really think we should evacuate now? So no one's actually thinking like that, but I think
Subconsciously.
And again, I should clarify. I don't actually know if it might be one of those truisms that gets thrown around, but I've heard at least that that's the case. People at least make jokes about it. They say like, why? Like I saw people saying like, you know, I'm not dying to a hurricane called Milton. You know, call it like Hurricane Death Destroyer 50,000 or something, because then it's going to scare me. But I'm not running away from Milton. You know? And I think like there might be some truth.
Formidable.
There might be some truth in that, and there's probably something similar going on in gendered languages, right? I mean, there has to be some psychological effect.
I think there definitely could be a subconscious effect, but also I think the gender of the Bible in its original language is also used for literary purposes. Like on each of the days of creation, it's interesting that third day of creation, when God creates the land and then the plants and the vegetation that come out of it, you see the sudden sprinkling of feminine words coming from the earth, which is another feminine word. So it's kind of seen as one of the most feminine days of creation, the third day. And it's also interesting that Tuesday is also a popular day for Orthodox Jewish weddings. I think one, because of that emphasis on femininity, and also it's the only day that God like says is good twice. So it's like a doubly blessed day. And I think original reader probably would have registered that the verse feels more feminine than other things that God were creating.
Sure.
And so there's an interesting thing happening there of masculine weeds and masculine trees coming out of the feminine earth that you definitely could mine for some materials, because definitely later, like on the sixth day of creation, when God forms a woman from a masculine man, Adam, people derive loads of meaning from that. But then paying attention to the gendered information of masculine grass coming from feminine earth is just seen as like not important. But what if that was communicating something essential about the structure of reality, the same way that people derive meaning from Eve coming from Adam? But for some reason, a lot of like fundamentalist people, I think Christians, would say that they have like a biblical view of gender and that their view of gender is derived from Genesis, which seems to be a bold claim if you've decided that the vast majority of gendered material and information is irrelevant.
It doesn't matter. Yeah. It's difficult to know.
Wow, so that was a lot. I had no idea about this day 3 being feminine. Can you guys talk about that?
Neither did I. So, okay, so Magnify says that day 3 is more feminine because there's an abundance or sprinkling of feminine terms used. And he says there's a sprinkling of feminine terms. And he says, and eretz, the only feminine noun other than eretz is yabasha, which is ground. So I think he references that when he mentions like masculine stuff coming from feminine, because Yabasha and Eretz are ground, and God says, you know, let the earth sprout tad haaretz. But there isn't a sudden sprinkling of feminine words. There are also other eretz and haaretz appear elsewhere in the text. Ruach is a feminine word that appears elsewhere in the text. So I don't really know what he's talking about when he says there's a sudden sprinkling of feminine words. There's only one in addition to eretz, and it's yabasha. He also suggests that on the sixth day, God forms woman from a man. So this conflates the two creation narratives, right? Creation narrative between Genesis 1:1 through 2:4 is one creation narrative, and then 2:5 and following is another creation narrative. There's no evidence in Genesis 1 that God is creating male that on day 6, where you actually get the days, and in Genesis 2 you don't get the days. In Genesis 1, you have on day 6 God creates male and female together, or at least there's no order of sequence. So it's kind of a bit misleading to say that on day 6 he created woman from man, because that's kind of collapsing these two very distinct narratives. He also says that a bunch of people wrongly ignore the gender of deshe, pri, zera as masculine, and then eretz and yabasha, which are feminine. But then he says that's a problem because it might indicate something essential about the structure of reality. I don't know what to say to this other than it doesn't. So it might be the case that, you know, late antique and medieval and modern, you know, mystical readers might like amplify that, but it's not there in the text because this is just not how language works. Grammatical gender is not some kind of cipher for how the sexes relate to one another or a way of communicating something about the structure of reality.
Yeah. Can I say some more about this? Yeah. I mean, you can check this, right? Like someone at home could check this and like just try and see if this adds up elsewhere. So I just opened up Bible software. Like let's search feminine nouns in Genesis. And you can see the sixth day has 6 feminine nouns in close sequence. Genesis 1:24. So are we to claim that the sixth day is actually more feminine? Is there like a mystical hidden feminine subtext? Because there's all these feminine words right there, close together. Like you can see how this game goes, right? Like, are we to say the sixth day is truly more feminine? But then male and female are made on the sixth day. So if there's ever a day for gender equality, right, it would be day 6. So you can see how this way of thinking is arbitrary, right? And you could like, I hope you can understand that you can open up a Bible software app, ask it to find verses with feminine nouns in it, and see that verses like this are all over the place, almost as if completely random, because it is just that. It's random. Why? Because this is what you'd expect from a grammatical trait that does not convey any special meaning. Just like other gender languages use gender for certain words, and no one who speaks that language thinks any more of it. So also with Hebrew. And like Logan, you nodded along or laughed along or something when, like, I think the French speaker or something said, "Hey, yeah, no, we don't determine anything from bridge being masculine."
Yes,
like, well, yes, there's the point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just stating that that this was different for ancient Hebrew is not an argument. There isn't any data for the Hebrew Bible that would support that kind of reading. So it's just that's just echoing what you said, Logan. Yeah, and I would agree that he conflates day 6 with in chapter 1 with the story about Adam and Eve. In chapter 2, he's just assuming that is true, that day 6 is imported into chapter 2. My own view is that these stories are complementary, with Adam and Eve describing something different and subsequent to Genesis 1, at least as the narrative is edited now. But he smuggles in the view that day 6 must be in the same story as Adam and Eve, which is very contested. In my opinion, it's incorrect. I think yours as well, Logan. So yeah, I don't think I want to talk anymore about the idea of biblical view of gender after what we just said. It's just,
Yeah.
it has it's an irrelevant point.
It seems pretty important to try to capture that. And what if the original person assembling the text meant for it to be disorientating?
Exactly.
What if they meant for it to be a bit of a whiplash?
Maybe
but the English Bible is translated in a way that kind of assumes that it's all supposed to be a seamless,
Just because of time, I'll just go ahead and say whatever he's going to say. So basically, he talks about like how there's different time period, different types of Hebrew in different portions of the text, and then Alex is like, "Hey, that'd be really cool if we could get, you know, the really late versions of Hebrew and write it kind of like the King James version, and then like earlier versions of Hebrew as like the, you know, the like we read it today." And in your notes, I'm going to steal your comment, Joel. You basically say, hey, yeah, that'd be really cool if we could translate the Old Testament based on source criticism via classical biblical Hebrew, middle biblical Hebrew, and late biblical Hebrew. I love this idea if one holds to the interpretation of the linguistic data. So thank you, Joel. That was great thought comments there.
No more comments. Yeah, if you hold to that distinction of classical biblical Hebrew, intermediate or transitionary biblical
okay.
Hebrew, and late biblical Hebrew. Yeah. Anyways, we can move on.
What else have we got?
We talked about gendered languages.
Yes, sir.
Oh, this is another interesting thing that's inserted into the text. And that's when Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That word God is interesting in that it has a big capital G, which is an interesting thing to do, to impose onto a language like ancient Hebrew that has no distinction of any capital letters. The first letters in a sentence are written in the same case that the last letter of the sentence is written in, and whether you're referencing a verb or any type of word, it's not going to be capitalized in Hebrew. But English, being derived from some older Germanic language that had some worldview that nouns have some kind of priority in the universe, and that anytime you reference a noun, it should be capitalized a head and shoulders above the other text, which is interesting. I guess English decided, okay, we're not going to do that for all nouns. Oh, that's interesting. Have you ever read, like, picked up something from like late 18th century,
Right.
and it's like every noun is still capitalized in
Yeah.
English?
Or maybe some. I think if you read like the Declaration of Independence, words like liberty and
Yes.
democracy, they're all sort of capitalized.
So English, I guess, decided we're not going to do the German thing of doing this to all nouns. But it is interesting that in that first verse of the Bible, you see a remnant of a very different philosophy that believes that nouns are more important than other figures of speech, which is, I don't think, an insubstantial difference. I think is a substantial difference.
Yeah, there are attempts throughout Scripture to put respect on the name of God through using sort of grammatical techniques. So capitalizing the word Lord in its entirety, or God, or putting Jesus's words in red, or things like this, which are clearly sort of not parts of the original language. But I mean, do you think it could sort of cause a problem of understanding for the text, this capitalization thing?
I think it's such a part of the worldview that you're approaching the text to as someone who is like immersed in came out of an English-speaking environment, that you may just have a priority that objects and nouns are more important than actions. And that's interesting because in ancient Hebrew, the priority is on verbs, and the verb comes before the subject as a norm. So there's really this philosophy you're projecting onto the text that objects have some sort of priority over actions,
Again,
which is not the biblical worldview, I would think.
Yeah, it's the importation of philosophical outlooks or biases or frameworks without necessarily realizing it. I just remembered I meant to ask on the gendered language stuff you were talking.
So what is the biblical worldview on this capitalization thing?
Yeah, Joel, you have a longer answer, but I'll just add some ad lib stuff briefly. This is like part and parcel of a very like pop view of language, that language always is determined primarily by philosophy and therefore reflects a philosophy. And this is just not how language development works. Like, the reason that English, or the reason that German capitalizes nouns, is not because it has an ideology that thinks that nouns are more important than verbs. Like, that's just not how the development of language works. Obviously, there is some often interplay between language and ideology and philosophy, and there's often feedback, right? But this claim that there's this whole framework that gives rise to the phenomenon of capitalization that is then being imposed on the text is like, it's hard to overstate how wrong this is. That's all I'll say, because I'm being angsty about it. But Joel, you have a better answer.
Oh, no. I would reiterate. Why does adding a capital make the noun more important? Where is he getting that value claim, right? Like, does any German speaker think that capitalized nouns have a greater value than other parts of the sentence? If you ask them, they would say no. It's just a convention, right?
Or do Germans think that objects are more important than events?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think Germans would say that across the board, right?
Yeah. In English, we capitalize proper nouns, specific persons, places, things. This doesn't make these things more important. It's just a means of helping us identify the referent. It is one way of helping us identify what we are pointed to in the real world in our communication with others. I just don't understand where he gets the value statement here. Why can't languages just do things differently but convey the same or very similar information? What really gets me, though, is he goes on to say, in ancient Hebrew, the priority is on verbs. The verb comes before the subject, is his claim, which is true in a lot of cases, but the priority thing. So he says, the English translation then makes, quote, objects have priority over actions, which is not the biblical worldview, end quote. To state that word order says something deep and profound about their worldview is a stretch. First off, like Logan just said, the Israelites inherited their language, right? Language is a developing thing. So it's not like there's a specific biblical language. Like here's the biblical language and not other language that exists. Like it's a development from earlier languages. So there's no biblical worldview here. It's an inherited thing. But Magnify's statement about the verb coming first is stating something about intentional emphasis and meaning. That there is an intentional emphasis and meaning is at odds with modern linguistic studies on word order in Hebrew, if I understand them correctly. So I'm going to give you a little citation here. This is from Moshavi, Word Order in Biblical Hebrew, Finite Clauses. It says, in the view of some scholars, word order is motivated by emphasis. The first element in every clause is emphasized, being the newest or most important part of the sentence. In the ordinary verb first clause, the emphasis is on the action expressed by the verb. If a different element, such as the subject, is emphasized, it will precede the verb. Recent works such as Revel, Shimasaki closely resemble this approach. In their formulations, the element which is the focus of attention is the one that occurs first. Viewed from the perspective of language typology, the view of biblical Hebrew described here, so which is like Magnifies, comes very close to the modern concept of the free word order language, in which the order of every clause is pragmatically motivated. In modern typology, however, languages are viewed as having free word order only when they do not exhibit a statistically dominant word order, a situation not applicable to biblical Hebrew, as we will see. Most 20th century scholars believe that biblical Hebrew does have a basic word order and that a pragmatic explanation should be sought only for marked word orders. According to the mainstream view, the basic order is verb, subject, object. Exponents of the basic verb, subject, object include, and then they go on to list a whole bunch, and then there's some who dissent from that as well. So what Moshavi is saying here is that having a verb first word order in a language that defaults to a certain word order, an unmarked word order, that default word order doesn't convey emphasis. So you shouldn't say that the verb first in Hebrew says that they prioritized the verb as though actions are most important. Rather, this is just the unmarked word order, and there is no specific emphasis for this ordering. It would be similar in English when we say, I went to the store. We expect the subject to come before the verb, and there's no perceived emphasis. If I said, the store, I went there, that change in word order does create an emphasis, just as like an analogy. So I just think he's misunderstanding how language works, which is kind of what you were saying at the beginning, Logan.
Well, and actually, I think if I'm right about English, usually we communicate new relevant information at the end of sentences, not at the beginning. But we can test that. I might be wrong about that.
Yeah.
Anyways, actually, just ignore that. You can just delete that, actually. Just delete that. I didn't say that.
You're not an English scholar, okay? So
I'm not. Yeah.
chill there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's maybe hop to anything more to say there, Logan? I have to be done in the next 15 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for that very reason, I was actually going to go real
skip
quick here.
Selah? Or sorry, skip.
I was just going to comment just really
Ezel?
quickly there.
Yeah.
So Magnify, he goes on this conversation about the word helper, ezar konegdo in Hebrew, where Eve is said the helper of Adam, and lots of people are like, oh, that must mean that he's subordinate to Adam and all that kind of stuff. So there's some interesting points to be made there, but we're not going to comment there. Later, there's Eve is created from Adam, so Eve is the what is it created from the rib, and so Magnified talks about how there's no Hebrew word for rib bone in Hebrew. Selah is translated as side or half or part by other people when it's talking about Adam and Eve. Now so what he's saying is these other English translators are being intentionally diminutive with the word rib. Rib is just so small and not as important. English translation of rib was for hierarchical purposes. What do you think about that, Joel?
Yeah, I'll be really quick. Just this word, Selah. we see in cognate languages, Akkadian, Ugaritic, that there are other words that all these languages are related, right? They're all around each other and in various times and periods, and we see that this word does mean rib in those other languages, and so it's really just a matter of could it mean this in Hebrew, and it only means it here, and we know it means it in other people who are speaking Semitic languages around. And I would say, yeah, it's not a biased translation in that sense. It's just this word can mean rib. It's not attested elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible in this sense, but that doesn't really matter because we know it was used in that sense around the time. And so it's not a matter of like a bias or a sexist translation or something. It just seems like that very well could be the meaning of the word based on what we know about other languages at the time. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a stretch then to say that there's a sexist bias or something coming in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there certainly could be a sexist bias, but that's completely apart from whether it's actually a good translation or not, right?
Yeah, from
Yeah,
the
there might be
English.
sexist
Yeah,
bias
yeah.
in the text, right?
Yes,
But it's
in the
not
text,
like-
but not in
it's-
English.
It's not like, oh, the text is egalitarian, but English is
Yeah.
super sexist. Like that's
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So I did want to add one quick thing there. So Magnify, he seems to imply that translators are like consciously thinking to themselves that they want to make women look bad in their translation. So like from my experience, my understanding of psychology and like talking to translators, I see this like extremely rare in translation is more often to me that just like people are taught this, therefore they keep believing it, like they don't question it. Other times it is a subconscious thing where people already have a low view of women and therefore they think, oh, well, of course God made women from rib because they are a low authority or value. So like that must be what the text must be talking about. It matches with my experiences. It already matches what they think of the world, so they don't consider other options. Otherwise, this can happen is that a translator might feel good about the possibility of women having a lesser rank than themselves as men. So when deciding how to translate, they think, oh, that makes me feel good, and they don't really question that idea because like it makes it feel good. So like if I decide to question it, then I get rid of that good feeling. So it's like really complicated translation and bias and all that kind of stuff. It's not as simple as like, oh, we're just trying to make these women look bad, right? Anything to add there?
I would only make that claim with respect to the translation of Genesis 2, Selah. I think there might be other places where you can really make an argument that certain translations or reveal a bias among the translators.
Sure.
But we're talking about this specific instance.
Yeah.
All right.
Do
in
we
English?
Last statement. Do you just want to actually, Zach? Do you just want to just describe it?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
He says we read Genesis 1:1 filtered through Greek and then English philosophical lenses. English was a language for trade. Hebrews didn't care about trade as nomads. These priorities are in the language. What do you think, Joel?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have actually a lot to say here. It's just a huge statement. I don't know how anyone would begin to assess this as to make an evidence claim about the comparison of like these languages in this way. Hebrew people clearly cared about trade. There are many laws about trade going bad, shady trading, like it's all over the Hebrew Bible. We know there was massive trade going across the ancient Near East at the time. Just as like a fun aside, I did a dig at Tel Shimron in 2017 when they opened that dig for the first time, and now they found like stuff from Crete, like Mycenaean wares from like 1800 BC. So that's a big, long stretch to trade across there, which there's only a few of those I think found up into the state in Israel from that time period. So it's like there's trade going on all the way back. So it's like, what does he mean, right? Like this is I just don't get it. I don't know how you would even start to make this argument and an analysis that somehow English is more trade driven and Hebrew is not. Like, I don't know. Logan, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, English is a language for trade. What does that mean? Was it invented for trade? Was it used for trade? If it was used for trade, does that mean that there are no native speakers? If there are native speakers, then are there native speakers who are not trading? And again, this is like the kind of pop linguistic idea that again, there's these entire philosophical frameworks that are embedded into every feature of the language and therefore feedback onto people. So therefore, English speakers are more naturally trade oriented in their ideology or something, even though they don't know it. There's a bit of evidence for something like a light version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that language influences your patterns of thinking, but absolutely not to this degree. If Esperanto became a universal language, it is that, right? Am I referring to it correctly? Right? You guys know about that language that was Is it called Esperanto?
I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, a reconstructed language. Yeah. Basically, a constructed language for like international, a kind of simple international language. That means that like Esperanto has this like international globalist ideology that's like embedded into it. Like no, like no one would say that, or maybe some people would say that, but it's just not correct. So again, this is just a kind of like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that like language influences the way you think, blown out of proportion. That not only does it influence the way you think, but it's there's philosophy embedded into it, and it's this trade philosophy that's embedded into it, which it's just the translation of into English does not require a philosophical commitment, like or a philosophical tainting of the text in any way. This is again, it's just not how language works. It's much more complicated and much more simple. That's all we got. Yeah.
Is there anything we want to do? Maybe as a wrap up or something? Any final? Are we there at that point? At the point of wrapping up? Zach?
Yeah, I'm good to make some final comments.
Go for it.
In general, I mean, this is maybe a very gatekeepy and elitist thing for me to say, but I think if you're going on a massive channel or you have a massive channel and you're having someone speak in this context about ancient Hebrew and its meaning, which it appears that Magnify is being set up as that, there really needs to be some vetting that goes on about to adjudicate whether the person that you're interviewing really has the right kind of expertise to speak on what they on what they on do they know what they're talking about basically. I think there's somehow been some problem or something has fallen through the cracks here where that wasn't done, and it's led to it's resulted in this very misinformed video on a channel that otherwise has really, really excellent content. That's all.
Yeah. No, I agree. It would have probably been helpful for some sort of vetting there to go on. We're not here to take down Magnify. I'm sure he's got lots of great content elsewhere. I'm sure he's probably, I haven't watched his content elsewhere. I imagine he's got 1 million or whatever plus subscribers. There's really interesting stuff going on there. But in this specific subject, this was wasn't something that he probably should have come on Alex's show for. It should have been something else related to whatever he does on his show, these shorts. There were just too many apparent issues that he hadn't actually taken the time to think through or hadn't learned, spent the time learning enough Hebrew to know what he's talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. And nothing against Magnify as a person, but it does just this merits a response. So that's why we did what we did.
All right. Appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much for coming on here. So everybody should check out Dr. Joel Koretko's channel. He's got lots of videos on there, really interesting stuff that he's doing in his scholarly work, and he's putting it out for the live audience. It's really great stuff. And then Logan Williams. So you've got some fun articles. I would assume you don't have like a YouTube channel. You have a podcast, you do, right?
Yeah, I am one of the co-hosts for the Two Cities podcasts.
Okay. Was there anything else that you want people to know about?
No.
Okay.
I'm not as online, so it's all right.
Yeah, he's doing this out of the kindness of his own heart. So
sure, we can go with that. Yeah.
All right. But, thank you guys so much for coming on. And otherwise, hope you guys have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.
Peace.
Thanks, Zach.